It's time for the Post-Mortem Report with your hosts Ronald McGillvray and Michael Schotter. Each month, these sultans of speculative fiction take a break from bending reality to ask one burning question. What cool stuff got buried in the social media graveyard while people were busy yelling at each other? Well, there's only one way to find out, so let's dig into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Post-Mortem Report. I'm your co-host, Michael Schotter.
And I'm Ronald McGillvray. Welcome to episode 10.
Bam! We did it.
That's
Good
it.
times.
10 episodes.
Yeah. We have a lot of exciting stuff to talk about this episode, but I think you have something very exciting that you need to tell the people about.
Well, I'm having lasagna for dinner.
Oh, dude. Not cool. I'm not having lasagna for dinner, and now I'm sad.
Well, that's okay. You know what else?
What's that?
I have a new book out.
Ah, nice.
Yes, I have a new book out. And you know what? Being not that bright, I didn't even have a copy of it. But if
that's okay.
Everyone out there on TV land, oh, you got one?
Oh, I'll use my magic.
Okay.
There it is.
Oh, there it is. That's my book, Cutters Deep.
Yeah.
Just got released yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
It's very exciting. Hopefully everyone gives it a shot, see what they think. It's a wild ride.
Well, and I will tell everybody I have already read this book twice. Not once, but twice. And it is quite good. You should definitely read it.
Thank you. I totally concur.
I thought you might.
Yeah, it was interesting. I wrote it for something that I'd be interested in reading, and it was just it was an interesting ride. I think everyone will enjoy it. It's certainly different.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, if you are interested in picking up a copy of that book, I think there's another little piece of news that we can share with everybody that they might be interested in hearing about, which is the fact that you and I, good sir, are going to be attending StokerCon this year.
That is
in
correct.
Lovely downtown Pittsburgh.
Never been.
We will not only be attending said convention, we will be manning a table at that very venue.
That's right. We'll be in the dealer's room.
Yes. So you will be able to find the Post-Mortem Report in the physical world and us and our smiling faces selling you books.
And we'll sign them too.
Indeed. Indeed. So
very generous.
If you are going to be attending StokerCon this year and you would like to meet us and perhaps pick up some of our books, and perhaps,
or all of them,
or all, yes, and perhaps also get a chance to end up in some of the footage that we may be recording while we're there, though all of those things might be able to happen. So June 15th through the 18th are the days. So that's, I believe, a Thursday till a Sunday in the lovely month of June. So mark your calendars. The Post-Mortem Report is taking over StokerCon, or at the very least showing up.
Yeah, and sitting behind a table.
Yeah, quietly and respectfully.
Yeah, and at some point, hopefully going to the mall where they shot Dawn of the Dead.
Yes, that is on the itinerary. I'm working all of that out, figuring out the logistics of that as we speak. The wheels are turning.
I want to see it. It'll be cool. That should be a fun weekend.
Indeed. Indeed.
So hope to see you there. If you're actually going, drop us a note.
Yeah,
in the
let us know if
comments.
you're going to be
Let
there.
us know you're there.
If you're going to be there
We'll,
and you want some books, let us know what books you want, and we'll be sure to make sure we have lots of them.
or if you're selling your books, you're going to be there, let us know so we can come visit as well.
Indeed. So, speaking of other folks who have books, that might be a good reason to talk about some birthdays that have occurred recently.
It's birthday time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've missed these birthdays that have gone by, we at Postmortem Report are bringing them back to life so you have a chance to go and wish them well and buy some books. So we'll start off. I'll look in my crystal ball. I see birthday for Aron Beauregard on was March 6th, author of The Slob and most recently Playground. So happy birthday to Aron.
Very nice.
Tim Wagner had a birthday March 8th. His book, Writing in the Dark, the workbook. You should check that one out. Tim Meyer, his birthday, March 11th, author of Malignant Summer. Happy birthday to Tim. Matthew Vaughn, his birthday was March 14th. His book, Bowery, is out. So if you want to make his birthday, which has already gone past a better one, check out his book. There's a birthday that I don't want to be remiss to forget is Michael Schotter. His birthday's March 15th.
Thank you.
He's the author of many books, namely 500, The Nemesis Effect, Shards, 309, among many others.
Yes, and you will be able to get your hands on copies of 500 at StokerCon. I'm almost certain I'll be bringing some of those. So look forward to that.
There you go. So happy birthday, Michael.
Thank you.
Mark Green, his birthday, he shares a birthday with you, also March 15th.
Another hopefully not victim of the Ides of March.
There you go. He has his book, A Bird Song, and also Abortus. So check those ones out. So happy birthday, Mark. James Watts, his birthday is March 17th. He has his Shadows of the Damned collection. So check that out if you get a chance. Ken King, his birthday, March 26th. He runs Sinister Realms on Facebook. It's a great group. If you have a chance, go check it out. Join up. I'm always kicking around there. So happy birthday, Ken, and all the best. And Jess Landry, March 28th. Her collection, The Night Belongs to Us. Check that one out as well. So happy birthday, Jess. Happy birthday to everybody. So if you missed anyone for the March birthdays, give them a shout, say hi. And that concludes our birthdays for this episode.
Excellent. Excellent. So, when we first started doing the show, and we've had a couple of these throughout the run of things, but we used to do more anniversaries because it used to originally be like the birthdays and anniversaries segment. But we haven't really done an anniversary in a while. So I thought, this being our 10th episode, that would be a good time to celebrate an anniversary of sorts. So we have something a little fun to show you guys. Have a look at this.
Happy anniversary to us.
Happy anniversary!
Happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary. Pour a cheerful toast and fill it, happy anniversary. But be careful you don't spill it, happy anniversary. Oh, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary. Celebrating merrily their happy anniversary.
So yeah, that's that. But as I said, this being our 10th episode, sort of our anniversary episode, if you will, we thought we'd do something a little different, a little special, try something a little new out on you folks, see what you think. So we are going to talk briefly and hopefully fairly succinctly about 10 things that we want to celebrate in the various categories that we typically talk about on the show. And how we're going to kick things off here is, rather than talking about specific books as we often do, we're going to talk first about 10 writers who we wanted to celebrate. So you want to kind of get the ball rolling for us with that?
Sure. It's Michael and Ronald's Top 10 show. So for writers, in no specific order, although I would have to say this is probably my favorite, is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Indubitably.
I've been hooked on Sherlock Holmes stuff for as long as I can remember. I mean, I've watched all the shows, the movies, the books. The Hound of Baskervilles was what got me started. I remember I picked it up at a bookmobile when I was just a young boy, and I've been hooked ever since. It's someone I can reread over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
You a fan?
Yeah, for sure. I've always appreciated a lot of the depth and sophistication in his writings, and how like forward thinking a lot of them were, right? When you consider just how long ago a lot of those things were written, and just how almost modern the prose feels in a lot of them. It's kind of stunning, really, for sure.
Yeah. It was just cool the way he had sort of that, his narrator wasn't even the main character kind of thing. It was just, I don't know, the whole thing.
Yeah, just such an iconic style, and such a a style that's really stood the test of time, which is, I think, the great thing about great literature, right? Just has that timeless quality to it. And that kind of leads us to my first pick, which is sort of in a similar vein, I would say, which is John Steinbeck. And probably the book for me that really seals the deal for Steinbeck is definitely Of Mice and Men. Like, that's the one that really kind of opened me up to just like the validity and like the importance and the just the benefits of really studying the classics in literature, and really understanding like the nuts and bolts of how books like that are put together, and like just the stunning like ability that he had, like just as a literary craftsman, I think is pretty amazing.
I love Mice and Men, but for me, I really like Cannery Row. No idea why. It just, that book totally captivated me.
It was funny because I've definitely heard of Cannery Row, obviously, but I was looking into it a little bit after you had mentioned that to me, and I had no idea that there was actually a sequel to that book, which I thought was kind of an interesting little thing. Apparently there's a book called Sweet Thursday, which I had never even heard of, which actually is set in the same area, and kind of, I wouldn't say it's a continuation of that story or those stories, but apparently it uses like the exact same setting as Cannery Row, which I thought was really interesting. Kind of made me want to read it.
You should check it out. I'd be curious to see what you think of Cannery Row.
Yeah, it's definitely one I feel like almost a little ashamed for not having read, especially because I'm like I say, I'm such a huge fan of Mice and Men. It's definitely one of my favorite books. So I kind of feel like sometimes, especially with the classic authors, there's a tendency to only read like their most, to only pick like one or two works and kind of focus on those. Yeah. And I often feel like with Steinbeck especially, like I really should go back and read more of his stuff, given how much I like Of Mice and Men. just because I know he's got at least like 20 or 30 books, that I haven't read. So,
Good pick.
yeah. So I know that will probably take us to your next pick to kind of keep the train rolling.
My next one is Robert B. Parker, author of the Spencer books. You watched
Nice.
the show Spencer for Hire or read any of his books? He
Was
had
definitely a
another
big
one.
fan of the show back in the day.
He had another very specific type of writing style. It just had a real flow to it. He used a lot of dialogue, but his stories just kind of flowed. I loved his writing style. And back then too, I was really into first person.
Mm-hmm.
So he was that. I still enjoy first person, but I've kind of branched away a bit because unless it's in a detective novel, or an untrustworthy narrator, it's you're very limited in what you can do with first person kind of thing.
Yeah. I've only used it myself a handful of times as a writer myself. But I feel like there's certain things that definitely really lend themselves to it, but it definitely has its limitations, I would say.
But it had everything. The sidekick, he had Hawk, who always came in,
Mm-hmm.
to help with the muscle and everything, and he had the police captains that were always his like allies, where
Mm-hmm.
other officials weren't his allies. So it's I've read every single Spencer book.
Oh,
I own
wow.
every one of them, and I've read every one of them.
Nice. Wow,
Yeah,
that is extensive.
yeah.
Well, I was about to say the person who I'm going to talk about next, I think I've read most of his works, but I wouldn't claim to have read all of them. Although I am a huge, humongous fan of his work, who is Edgar Allan Poe. Uh, Obviously, very well known for his short fiction, but also for like some pretty amazing poetry as well. And I would say, like, in terms of like influences or like people who I feel like have really had like a profound influence on me as like a writer and a reader, Poe's definitely like right up there, right? He's definitely right up there in like my top three for sure. Just things like The Pit and the Pendulum, Fall of House of Usher, Telltale Heart, all of that stuff. And then, of course, things like The Raven, for the poetry side of things. But yeah, Poe, just a
Yeah.
just banger after banger as far as short fiction goes.
And he's become iconic in himself. Like it's just I think in one of our episodes we talked about, I think it was Altered Carbon,
Mm-hmm.
where one of the characters is
Yeah, the
actually
hotel manager.
yeah,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe, the
This
hologram
really
of him.
was one of the coolest parts of that show, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's movies. The new one, it was the Pale Blue Sky, or
The Pale Blue Eye,
yeah,
right?
it just yeah. I
Yeah.
think we just
Where
talked
he's
about that
like
in one of the past episodes.
teaming up with a detective to solve a
Yeah,
mystery or
yeah,
something like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So his persona has taken on a
Yeah.
whole thing on its own, which is really sort of interesting. So
Yeah, it's very cool, especially given like the tragic circumstances of his life, in
yeah,
reality, to kind of see him almost getting a new life, arguably a much cooler life than he probably
yeah,
actually
probably had.
actually
Yeah,
led, right? Being sort of underappreciated and undervalued in his time. Um, yeah, that's really cool. Poe's definitely right up there for me. Uh, but in the interest of keeping things moving, you can talk about someone who also could have easily made my list, but I let you have him.
you're too kind. My next pick is Stephen King, the
Mm-hmm.
King of Horror.
Mm-hmm.
He is probably the one author that influenced me the most in horror. Um, you know, I was just a young guy when Carrie came out, and then Salem's Lot just solidified it for me. And of course, he's become so iconic as well. With all his books have become movies, so you get him everywhere. He's on his books, he's on movies. He's a sort of a celebrity in his own right. You see him like everywhere at in interviews and stuff. And in the 80s, he was like, I think he was on Time magazine. He was
just like larger than life, basically. Yeah. In a lot of ways.
Started horror, and so he had a major influence on me. So
yeah, I definitely am a big fan of King's horror stuff, for sure. But I would say even for me, like I really do think of him as like one of the quintessential speculative authors, right? That just even expands out beyond the horror genre into a lot of other really interesting places. Because like for me, the big one, right? Like the big thing that I put like head and shoulders above everything else that he's done is the Dark Tower series, right? Like those books I've read many times and deeply love some of them, like to an almost unhealthy degree, things like The Gunslinger and The Wasteland and Wizard and Glass, like are just some of my all-time favorite books that I think are just basically perfect for me at least. So yeah, King, just hard to argue with him, but it's also one of those things where he's touched on so many different genres and subgenres and done so many different things throughout his career. It's just amazing. Like that's crazy stuff.
Well, his strength is really in his characters and the settings that he puts them in, which have become iconic as well. Castle Rock is these small towns kind of thing. And so it's
I feel like we've talked about it on the show previously, right? Like there's just certain concepts and certain settings and certain ideas at this point that he almost just owns, right? That like you couldn't even really go there as an author without like flirting with those sorts of comparisons, So definitely mad respect there for sure.
So Stephen King's my pick. And now you get a chance.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of clarify my sort of take on King, because I know for me, like kind of my probably personal biggest horror influence is probably Clive Barker, and mostly because of one particular book, which is Cabal, which I read at like a very key age, that I think that book really just hit for me in this really deep, kind of potent way, where it really showed me like the power of horror as a genre and the sort of the way it can like get under your skin and get inside your head in a way that I think no other genre really can. And to the point where like I still to this day consider like Buttonhead to be like one of the greatest like villain characters that I've ever read in a book. Like I think like that bar is set so high for me from that book. And of course there's so much cool stuff in Cabal, with the Boone storyline and Midian and the Nightbreed and all that sort of thing. Like all that stuff is awesome. But that's the Buttonhead villain in that book is just like ingrained in my psyche. Because I was just at that age at the time where I read it, that it like planted a seed inside my head that's just always been there ever since. So big shout out to Clive Barker for the horror genre for me, for sure.
That's my favorite as well, and I love the movie that was based on it.
Nice.
But he, just like King, they both were really good short story writers.
Oh yeah,
his Books of Blood and
again, similarly to King, right? Like Clive Barker has had some really diverse works as well too, like things like Imagica, just to throw one out there as a random example. Like that book is so radically different from a lot of other things that he's written. So I definitely wouldn't want to pigeonhole him either. But like, like I said, just for me personally, like as a big horror influence, like Barker's just like right up there. But that kind of leads us, I think, to your next pick, which I know is very influential for you.
Yeah, is probably no surprise either, is Joe R. Lansdale. His book, The Drive-In, actually changed everything for me when I read it. I'd never read anything like it. I was just like, it was, to me, it was like what expanded what horror could be. You know, it wasn't castles and bats and stuff. And I was just like, this is what I want to do, and I want to read more. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of stories like The Drive-In.
Yeah.
It was just one like an iconic story, and but he, like Clive Barker, like Stephen King, he's grown as well. I mean, his Hab and Leonard series, lots of books, and they're sort of crime mystery with humor in it. Once again, it's really strong characters. Yeah, it's I guess when the authors were looking at it, just sort of, don't pigeonhole yourself, be able to grow. They're good examples and good role models to follow.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good thing to note, right? Is that a lot of these sort of the biggest names and the most iconic, people that you could mention in some of these genres, they really did diversify, especially as they evolved throughout their career, right? They didn't stay in one place creatively, and I think that says a lot, and I think that's an important thing to kind of note about their success for sure. But speaking of success, let's switch gears a little bit away from horror and talk about arguably one of, if not the most successful science fiction writers of all time. My next pick, Isaac Asimov. Because I think if you're talking about iconic science fiction series, things like the Foundation series and the Robot series, Asimov's pretty much legend, for lack of a better term, in that genre for sure.
Prolific.
Yeah, definitely. And I would definitely admit there's plenty of Asimov stuff that I have not even had the chance to familiarize myself with, even being a big fan of his work and a big fan of the genre. So there's definitely a lot to explore there. And actually, when I was a kid, especially, his name was really ingrained into me from reading things like Asimov's Science Fiction and Fact magazine. A lot of the authors that I got exposed to, throughout the 80s, especially, were people who I discovered from reading their shorts and reading their serialized novels and stuff in Asimov's. In fact, we talked about Falling Free, that Lois McMaster Bujold book, a couple episodes ago, and that book was one I read serialized, in that magazine originally. So yeah, Asimov just has had such a huge impact on that genre in so many different ways. It just would have been impossible for me not to mention him.
Fine choice.
Well, speaking of fine choices, who do you have next?
Well, my final pick, last but not least, is Neil Gaiman. Is another one that one of his stories. I mean, a lot of his stories or books I've enjoyed, but Neverwhere is just a book that blew me away. I think each of these authors that I picked has a book that I was like, I wish I had thought of that. And Neverwhere was just one of those books where I was just totally captivated by the whole idea of, a world underground, in London. I guess it was a kind of exotic too, being in Canada. It was a different world, to experience, and but all his books are brilliant.
Yeah.
He's a really good writer. He has a whole Sandman series as well with the graphic novels.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he's someone that I believe everyone should check out.
For sure. And kind of leading into my last pick for writers, I think this is a good correlation, because sometimes you'll have an author where they just make that one thing that's so like profound and so like influential and like just hits so hard that it almost like it almost does them a disservice, right? Because then the rest of their catalog maybe gets overshadowed by that thing a little bit. And I know that was definitely the case for me with Daniel Keyes and Flowers for Algernon, which again, like kind of staying in the science fiction mode that I've been in.
Right.
That was such a huge, massively influential science fiction read. And also just from like, again, a literary standpoint, and from the standpoint of just something that had such powerful emotional impact. Like I don't think there's very many things I've read that like hit me as hard in the feels as Flowers for Algernon did. Like that book is the book will almost like emotionally cripple you if you're not ready for it. Like, but yeah, just amazing writing. Like that book alone would be worth exploring that author's work for, I would say, just because of its sheer magnitude.
Well, that was a fine list of writers.
Yeah, I'd say that gives people a lot of things to chew on, if nothing else.
Should be checking those ones out.
For sure, obviously with these lists, right? Like there's so many more names that could be on them, right? Like I know we were talking about this a little before we started the show, that like it would have been so easy to like, come up with 20 or 30 or 50 people to talk about, so. And again, like that's kind of one of the reasons why we're not putting this stuff in any particular order, because I feel like with stuff like this, it almost doesn't matter. Like it's all great. It's all stuff worth checking out.
You can't go wrong with our top 10 list of writers. Check them out today.
Nice. Well, keeping in that vein, let's shift and talk about 10 music artists worth celebrating. And we're going to kick things off here with your personal favorite,
The Who.
Very nice.
The original Who, with Pete Townsend, Roger Daltrey, Keith Moon, John Entwistle. An iconic band. They brought to life the rock opera for all to enjoy. All their albums were great. They're amazing live. Just a major part of my my youth. They pump you full of energy.
Nice. And if you want to hear a more extensive discussion of the Who, and specifically their album Quadrophenia, you can find that in an earlier episode. So go hunting for that if you haven't already seen it. But that leads us into my first pick, which again, keeping with the theme of heavy influence, right? So this was the very first band and the very first album that I bought on CD when I got my very first CD player back in the day, was actually Boston's first self-titled album. And that album, I would say, easily one of the most concentrated collections of straight up bangers you're ever going to hear put to tape. I think there's very few albums that can step to that one in terms of just raw ass kickery. So
it was amazing album.
Yeah,
amazing band. Not prolific though.
No, not prolific. And I would say, if I'm being honest, probably some diminishing returns on their subsequent albums. But man, man, they hit it out of the park on that first one. And we had talked a little bit earlier in the writing segment about things that have a timeless quality to them. I feel like More Than a Feeling is a great example of a song that could be released at any point in time and feel new, right? Like if that song came out today, I feel like it could be just as big of a hit and just as resonant and like valid and like meaningful as it was at the time it was released. That song I think is like eternal in a lot of ways.
They're a great band. Their second album was really good.
Yeah. Don't Look Back is a banger too, for sure. Especially that title track. It's really, really strong. But without dwelling on anyone too long, let's move on to your next pick.
My next pick would be the Ramones. A fine, outstanding young group of men. Very clean cut, well behaved.
Yes. Well mannered.
Their digs at the CBGBs in New York when I was there, even though CBGB doesn't exist anymore, I went there and had a picture taken of me, which wasn't very flattering. So I never showed it to anybody, but I stand there. It was kind of like just a storefront now, but it has the address. It's in the Bowery. And, all there, they had their album Rock and Roll High School, not their album, the movie Rock and Roll High School. And when I saw it was just, I couldn't believe it when I was a kid and when I watched it, but it was, all the songs, Rock and Roll High School. There was Phil Spector did that with his Wall of Sound. But they're just, for a group that supposedly didn't even really know how to play at the beginning, they sure could crank them out. They found a particular sound and they went with it, and it's like the Who, just full of energy. I guess it's what drives me to them. I just like listen to it and go.
I think the thing that I always think of with them is just integrity and like just commitment, right? Like they just they knew what they were, they knew who they were. They weren't putting on any airs or trying to like pretend that they were something that they weren't. They're just like, no, we're here, we're doing this, deal with it. I can respect that. Yeah.
So that would be my next pick.
Nice.
How about you?
So my next pick is somebody who I think is in a lot of ways very different from the Ramones, but similarly prolific, who would be Elton John, who was a major influence on me, especially when I first started learning how to play musical instruments and first started songwriting and things like that. Like I think him being such a quintessential musician really had a big impact on me. And I mean, obviously his songwriting collaborations with Bernie Taupin, being the lyricist that he was, very highly influential for sure. And it had just some great, amazing albums. Probably one of the best double albums ever in Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, I would say, and just a ton of great music.
Yeah, and he sang "Pinball Wizard" by the Who. Yes,
in the movie. In the movie.
Yeah. Did you see the movie Rocket Man?
I did. I thought that was pretty entertaining. Yeah. I enjoyed it.
So there's a lot of stuff actually I kind of learned from it.
Yeah, that scene where he's literally at the piano writing Your Song is really great. Like I think it's worth watching that movie just to see that one scene, that like 5 minutes of him there sort of noodling on the piano trying to figure it out. And actually, like, I think that scene really captures so well the essence of songcraft, where you just have this vague idea and you're kind of trying to suss it out as you're playing. I have seen very few scenes put to film that capture that as well as that does. It's really great. It's really exceptionally well done.
Yeah. It just brought him more to life, and also probably brought a lot of fans from a younger generation that saw the movie that would go back and take a listen.
For sure.
So,
yeah, definitely would recommend that one. It's well done.
Fine pick.
Speaking of bands that transcend generations, let's hear about your next pick.
My next pick is Styx. This was my very first concert was Styx. First band I ever saw.
Yeah.
And when I left, I think my ears rang for like 24 hours. I thought literally there was something wrong. I remember leaving the arena and walking out and go, why are my ears ringing like this? But
why do the things I love always hurt me?
Yeah. They were loud. They have that high pitch. They have the high with the vocals, their sound, but they have that sort of that bombastic sound, which I guess I'm really sort of into. I mean, so many great albums, Equinox, Crystal Ball, Grand Illusion, Pieces of Eight, which we talked about in a previous episode.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you want to see a really extensive discussion of Styx, episode 8, you can find that if you haven't seen it already. But for sure, definitely.
They're still going strong. And now
great band.
They have, as their keyboardist, they have Gowan, a fine Canadian. I'm actually was a big fan of Gowan before he joined Styx. So people should check out Gowan's work. Now, I have to admit, I was sad when Dennis DeYoung didn't come back because he's such an iconic part of the band. But I saw Dennis DeYoung actually in Toronto, Dennis DeYoung doing Styx, and he still got it. But I won't take up too much time. But Styx. Fine band. Don't care what anyone says. I know there's a lot of haters out there. And they still haven't been in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is a travesty.
Like I said, very extensive Styx discussion in episode 8, which is why I'm refraining from chiming in on some of these points. But let me just say, hard agree on all of it, and we'll move on.
All right. Tell us what you got next.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about a band who's actually, I think, maybe a little bit overlooked because they're so huge. Sometimes people kind of forget about them, which is U2. And one of the main reasons I wanted to bring them up is because I was thinking about some of my best concert experiences. And I actually went and saw them for their Elevation tour, which was right after their big album, All That You Can't Leave Behind, came out. And that was a really great time, I think, to see them because they were very much at the top of their game in terms of like their popularity and their discography and all that sort of thing. And I just remember thinking when I saw that show, like, okay, I'm good. I've seen U2. They were awesome, and they did pretty much every song I could have ever hoped that they would play, and just absolutely killed it. And I'm like, excellent, box checked, very happy with this experience. And I feel like that's always a great thing, right? Like when you kind of have an idea in your head of like what you're hoping a band is going to be like when you see them live, and I feel like they did not disappoint. Like they were very on point in their live show. So wanted to give them a little shout out.
Yeah, they're a great band. I mean, when I first started hearing it was like the early 80s, with Sunday Bloody Sunday, War, Joshua Tree. I think what happened is they're another band that really, we're talking about the writers who just branched off and tried lots of different things.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like some of those more like off the wall things like Zooropa and Pop and stuff like their later albums are definitely way on the experimental side of things, like in a cool way. Yeah.
So I think with them, a lot of, they were huge in the 80s, and then they tried different things. And I think some of the original fans didn't follow along with it, but then they gained new fans, and it just kind of they keep like evolving kind of thing. But that's probably why they don't get the same kind of reverence as some other bands, because they are so different with their stages.
Yeah. Well, and I feel too, like I say, they were so huge and so ubiquitous almost at a certain point that you almost kind of forget how big they were, right? Because at a certain point, they were literally like the biggest band in the world for like 10, 15 years. I mean, pretty much arguably. But then like, it's kind of like, where do you go from there, right? There's literally nowhere to go from there.
I know.
But yeah, U2, very, very, very cool band, very, very good band. And especially, these days, in recent years, I think you maybe don't see them getting like the kudos or the recognition that they once got. But I would say for sure they made their mark and definitely have their place in the sort of musical cosmos.
Yep. I agree.
Speaking of cosmic stuff, why don't you tell us about your next pick?
My next pick would be Pink Floyd.
Excellent.
Which is funny because in my early days, I didn't really enjoy them as much. I didn't know a lot about them. I mean, most of the music, well, if you look at my other picks, were all very, very loud, very fast. And of course there was Dark Side of the Moon, which was incredible, but it was too mellow for me at that time. And I didn't really appreciate how great an album it was. Then The Wall came out, and that blew me away. And then I started going back, and that's when I started to really appreciate what they did. And then I just grew with them ever since. And they're just another band with just an iconic sound.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, David Gilmour, easily top guitar players of all time, hands down, no doubt about it, and a great songwriter just to boot on top of that.
Yeah, and with the original like Roger Waters. I mean, I even love a lot of his sort of independent stuff, not independent, but the solo stuff. Now that he just does it, I've seen him a couple times in concert as well, and he puts on a great show. Well, Pink Floyd shows, Roger Waters shows, they're very, very similar. You can tell that most of their ideas came, in those formative years, and then they both, when Roger Waters left, they both do their own thing with it. But that whole sound is something else, and I just really grew to appreciate them more and more. So they're one of my influential bands.
Yeah, nice. For me, you always hear people talk about Dark Side and The Wall, and even Wish You Were Here, I think is a pretty popular album as far as Floyd goes. But I definitely would want to throw out a couple of their more obscure ones too, things like Metal and Obscured by Clouds, and some of their earlier work I think is also equally amazing and equally like stuff that people should definitely pay attention to from their discography for sure. And I'm even a fan of like the post Roger Waters stuff, like Momentary Lapse of Reason and the Division Bell and stuff like that as well.
I really like Division Bell, actually.
Yeah. That was a really great way to show that they still had it, right? Like at the point that album came out, like I'm sure there were a lot of people wondering, like, can they even make music at that level anymore? And I think that album very quickly silenced any such contemplation.
Yeah.
Nice. Floyd is definitely great though. That's a great pick.
And what do you have
for
us?
I'm going to be a big cheater with my next pick because I'm going to pick a super group just because there's so many people in this band that were just so great and it kind of covers a lot of bases with one hit, which is the Traveling Wilburys, which of course has featured several artists over the years, but kind of started out with sort of the core of George Harrison, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, and Bob Dylan.
Actually, wasn't I can't think of his name now, from ELO.
Jeff Lynne. Yes.
Jeff Lynne, I think he was one of the.
Yeah, I believe that was the core five from the first album or two. And that was a fun project. That was a great example, I think, of, all these people with this immense individual talent coming together to make some really cool, fun, exceptionally well-crafted music, and do it in a way that wasn't like overblown or pretentious or like too much, right? Like they all had this really great knack of being able to come in and contribute their individual parts to those projects without going too far, right? Or letting their own like personal egos or whatever get in the way, and just making, like I said, really good, fun, catchy, enjoyable music. So I felt like that was a project worth shouting out that hasn't really been on the radar for a lot of people, I think, in quite some time.
Yeah, I should look up. I'd be curious to find out like how it is they actually got together.
Yeah, I believe the story behind that is actually pretty tied to Jeff Lynne, because his whole thing was that he was very like Beatles obsessed, right? So I think the actual story behind that is he literally conceived of that whole thing just as an excuse to work with George Harrison, like directly, and then it kind of just became well, who else can we pull into this sort of thing? But I think he was kind of the catalyst for that, because at the time that they formed, that was kind of where he was really shifting into a music producer role as much as an artist role. And so he was producing just a ton of other people's stuff. And I think that's what kind of laid the groundwork for all of that to happen. But I'm sure some proper music historian could correct me on that, but I believe that that's accurate.
I'll take a look, because ELO was another great band.
Oh yeah, ELO could easily made my list as well, for sure. But I kind of feel like I kind of get to lump them in there with that. So like I said, totally cheating.
Yeah. Well, fine pick.
Nice. Well, I know you're about to make a very fine pick, so I will bow down and let you do that.
Well, we're going Canadiana, because I would be remiss if I didn't pick one of my favorite bands, R.U.S.E.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'll never argue with that.
Yeah. There's another band that you can go back into our archives and, check us out. We'll be talking about them.
Episode 6.
I can't. Good memory.
That's right.
I was just going to generalize.
Yeah.
I've seen them countless times. Another band that can really put on a show. And for 3 guys, they have a sound like no other. It's and once again, they're a group that just grew. Their sound expanded, changed. They had no fear. These trio, they just tried. They did what they wanted to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, again, another example of a band that kind of finished their career on a real high note. You're talking about like Clockwork Angels, which ended up kind of becoming their final album, like easily one of my favorite albums of theirs. And then like a real testament to their ability as musicians, like I think is really summed up so nicely on that album. And just was like a great kind of swan song for them. So, but
it's sad that they, had to end with, Neil.
Yeah. Very, very much a bummer. But I feel like they were so prolific and so accomplished so much for so long that I almost don't even feel all that bad about it. Like even being as huge of a fan of them and their stuff as I am, like I don't feel like they left too much on the table, right? Or too much left unfinished or undone. And I feel like they're like a great example of a band whose legacy will just like live on like for a very long time just because of how like accomplished they were.
Well, certainly stand the test of time.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
And what is your last one?
Yeah, so I know we've been kind of going to the vault with a lot of these picks, so I wanted to throw in at least one kind of more modern pick. And this is a band who I really got on my radar because of one specific album. So the band is called The Sword, and this album of theirs called Used Future, which I remember hearing this for the first time a few years ago. I believe that album came out in, I want to say 2019. I'll throw it up on the screen if that's not accurate. But they kind of brought back this whole idea of the concept album, right? Which was a very big popular thing in like the 70s, right? And basically creating an album that had sort of like a running theme, both musically and lyrically through its entire duration. You know, we talked about Dark Side of the Moon earlier, talking about Floyd. And I think in a lot of ways, this Used Future album has a lot of those elements of a great concept album to it. You know, a lot of recurring themes and refrains in the music itself. Again, a lot of very deftly executed lyrical flourishes that kind of tie a lot of concepts together, and just some really banging, great, hard rocking, just immediately accessible and enjoyable music that kind of, to me, gave me like some really strong like Black Sabbath vibes.
Yeah.
And kind of reminded me a lot of like them in their prime and like when they were really like hitting on all cylinders. And so yeah, if you haven't checked them out, and specifically that album, I would definitely highly recommend it.
All right. And those are our music artists.
Nice.
We've given you writers. We've given you musicians.
Yep.
Well, Michael, tell us what we've got next.
Well, Ron, next we're going to talk about movies.
Who doesn't love movies?
Yes. So you are going to talk about one of my all-time favorite movies to kick things off, which I am super excited about. So let the people know what's on your mind.
All right. Here goes our top list for movies. Jaws is my first pick. This movie is just iconic. I thought you were going to do it throughout my whole thing. I was going to pace my talking while you were doing it.
Yeah, no, sorry to disappoint.
Why did I do that? Yeah. I saw this at a drive-in. Luckily, nothing crazy happened like in Joe Lansdale's drive-in, but I went with my parents.
Really terrifying.
That would have been something, yeah. But my parents took me, and I remember there were times where I actually looked away in the back seat. I was just, because I was really young, and so you can imagine how old this movie is. But this is a movie that, stands the test of time as well.
For sure. I've watched it very recently, and it still holds up.
Yeah, it was, once again, the characters are really good. Just when they're just sitting in the boat talking at one point.
Yeah.
It's just everything, the flow, the acting. It was just the way the terror was built up, which is funny because in this movie, it was the mistakes and the problems they were having actually was the catalyst to probably what made it such a fantastic movie.
Absolutely. Like the history of that movie and on all the details of how it was actually made and the things they had to overcome in the making of it and how those led to, like you said, the great, like, iconic elements of it are really, really fascinating. And I mean, you kind of touched on it there briefly, but like just that one scene where they're drinking on the boat at night, and like Robert Shaw's doing his whole speech about the Indianapolis and all that, and then when you hear the story about how like when they first tried to record that scene, he was so smashed that he couldn't even do the dialogue as written. So then he like came back the next day and was like, I got to nail this, and basically like did that whole scene in one take, that whole speech in one take, and like just crushed it. Just stuff like that, right? Just like you really see just how special and like almost kind of magical a thing that was from seeing the behind the scenes on it.
So yeah, horrifying, great characters. It's the whole package.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So if you've been from living on Mars for the last little while, you should check out Jaws.
Yeah,
fine movie.
Yeah,
fine
nice.
Movie. Some of the others not so great.
Yeah,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or whatever.
Diminishing returns, what I'd say.
Yeah, but the original was something else.
Yeah.
What do you have for us, Michael?
Speaking of living on Mars or in space and things that might be horrifying, my first movie pick is actually Event Horizon, which I know that movie has kind of a mixed sort of reputation, let's say, among moviegoers, but I am personally a really big fan of it. I actually saw it in the theaters when it briefly manifested in theaters when it first came out back in the day. And being a big Sam Neill and Lawrence Fishburne fan, I was sucked in completely and thoroughly enjoyed that movie, and really loved the whole like haunted house in space kind of aspect of it, and also really respected like the nods to actual science that they laid down in that movie that I think a lot of people who criticize it tend to overlook, because there is some actual like pretty decent science stuff in that movie too. But yeah, very, very cool flick that I think is sometimes a little underappreciated.
Well, anything in space creeps me out.
Yeah.
Well, anything underwater and anything up in space. I don't like anything above me.
Covered both bases with these first two picks. Yeah.
There you go.
Nice. Well, let's see. If you aren't going to go in the water and you aren't going to go in space, where can you go, and is it safe?
Well, it's safe if you have a Godfather looking out for you.
There you go.
So there's my next pick, is The Godfather. Actually, both 1 and 2, incredible movies. The acting was brilliant. The whole, once again, there's a lot of tension in that. It was just, it's not just what was on, but just the waiting for stuff to happen kind of really built everything. And the scenery, this is just one of those, like, everything about The Godfather was amazing.
Yeah.
It's just one of those movies. It's like everything was good about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who say that is a perfect film, and I think you could very easily make that argument.
It's if you like crime, and it's just not about a crime story, but it's like about family, as well. So you're really Gratian. There's so many like levels and layers. But yeah, The Godfather.
If you haven't seen it, check it out. So, without going too far down the rabbit hole, as we could very easily do, let's shift gears and talk about what was probably for a good chunk of my life what I would have considered to be my favorite movie, although I don't necessarily know if I'd continue to say that these days, but the original Highlander from 1985 with Christopher Lambert, and one of, I think, the best independently produced films that I've ever seen. Like that was a thing about that movie that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that it wasn't actually a major studio production, despite being very well put together.
Yeah, it was such a great concept.
Mm-hmm.
And there can only be one.
Yeah, definitely. You can't have two. That definitely can't have two. That's not acceptable. Nobody's buying into that. But yeah, great movie, great action, some really memorable scenes and really quotable lines of dialogue and stuff like that. Great, like you said, great concept and great unique experience to have. Like if you haven't seen that movie or heard of it or been compelled to check it out, I think that's a movie that could really end up surprising you, especially if you really don't know anything about what you're getting into before you watch it. Because you were talking about the drive-in and how that's such a unique premise and something you really don't see like reflected anywhere else. I think that movie is a good example of a truly like unique premise that you really haven't seen duplicated elsewhere. So
I really enjoyed it when it came out. So I'd have to watch it again, see if it aged well.
Yeah. I still love it. I've seen it many times, not so much recently, but I do still have a soft spot in my heart for it, and I'm sure even if some parts of it haven't aged particularly well, I still would probably give it a pass, just because it was so great and such a big deal for me for such a long time. But moving on, let's talk about your next movie.
My next movie would be Rocky. I loved all the Rocky movies, and I don't really care what anyone says. I like the Creed movies as well. They're all excellent. They're all make you feel good.
Yeah, the feel good vibes are definitely there.
Yeah, it was just with Rocky the original though, just the down on your luck guy, the underdog coming back. It's another iconic film. It's just another one I personally think is almost one of the, like a perfect film.
Yeah. I would agree with that, especially that first one.
Yeah.
I'd say that's a pretty easy argument to make.
Yeah, it was just the characters, everything. It was like a character-driven movie. The running down the streets.
With the montage, the birth of the montage.
Yeah. It's just everything was just very iconic and very raw. Loved it. Makes me want to go
as well.
jogging.
The score, which has such a huge impact on all of that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. That that goes to show. If anyone ever says, "Well, sound and music," when they do the award shows, the Oscars just going by or just aired, they talk about stuff like sound editing and sound, and people are like, well, I don't want to care about that. I want to see who the actors are. But there's no great movie unless there's great sound.
Yeah. I mean, if you took the audio out of those scenes from Rocky, it would be a completely different experience. Like that audio makes that what it is for sure.
Yeah. But love me some Rocky.
Yeah, love the whole series, and I would say, like, as much as I love like the more serious films in the series, like the first one and like Rocky Balboa and that sort of thing. If I gotta be honest, like if I'm like picking one randomly off a shelf to just throw in to watch for like the 10 millionth time, probably gonna be Rocky 4. It's probably gonna be Rocky 4.
Wow.
Yeah. So take that for what it's worth. You do you, but that would be my pick probably.
There you go. I'm gonna stick with Rocky.
Yeah. Well,
right.
I
so
definitely.
What do you?
Yeah, I definitely have a soft spot for the over the top sometimes. That's where that comes from. But moving on to my next pick, Speaking of the over the top, let's talk about Radioland Murders, which
Quite a pick.
Yeah, I think maybe a lot of people won't be familiar with this one, but you probably would be familiar with some of the names that are associated with it, because this was one of George Lucas's first attempts at producing a movie that he didn't actually have anything to do with in terms of writing and directing and whatnot. So that's kind of how this movie got made. But what it basically is it's a story about a radio station back in the 30s that's trying to go to become a new national syndicated radio network. And they're basically having their premiere, right? Their debut of being simulcast, for the first time nationwide. And as this show is playing out and it's unfolding, people start getting murdered, like live on the radio, in various weird and bizarre circumstances. And one of the people who's working on the show becomes the primary suspect. And so he has to spend the rest of the movie basically trying to figure out who the actual killer is and prove his innocence, while also still trying to pull the show off and make it work and complete the task of making this happen. So as you might imagine, this is sort of like a bit of a black comedy. It's definitely more of a comedy than it is a drama, but it is really well structured from a storytelling standpoint, to the point where you really do become engrossed in the murder mystery part of it and kind of trying to figure out the whodunit aspect of it. And then, of course, it also pays a really great homage to that era of radio, right? And doing like things live on the air and things like Foley work, and creating sound effects, and producing a live show that's being broadcast, to the nationwide audience. And so there's a bunch of different moving parts to that one. And I think it's really well written, really well acted. It's got like just a good like vibe and pacing and like feel to it. And I think anybody who's ever done anything in the theater, especially, or in sort of live broadcast or live radio, would definitely 100% appreciate like a lot of the things that it touches on, because I think it touches on those things better than almost anything else that I've seen that treads that ground.
But there's no lightsabers.
No lightsabers, no. You will be sorely disappointed if you're looking for lightsabers. But there is a cool little technology-related twist at the end of the movie, which I will not spoil, that you might find interesting if you're looking for gizmos and gadgets and whatnot. So that's my sort of more obscure pick for movies, I would say. So what do you got next?
My next one is going into space. Would have to be Alien.
Nice.
Yeah.
Reestablishing our tradition of talking about the Alien franchise in nearly every episode.
Yeah. This is another movie that just had, creep me out. Once again, everything about space creeps me out. People go, "Oh, I'd like to be an astronaut. I'd like to go up there." Like, I don't want to go up there. I don't care if they gave me a free flight to go. There's nothing good up in space. So it's and I, for rewatchability, I think we discussed this in the past too, is like Aliens, because it has, the more frenetic, action and everything. Mm-hmm. But Alien started it all. So I'm always going to stick with Alien. It, just the tension of being, up in space and alone and not knowing what this thing is, except that it like burst out of one of your, buddy's chest, and you're walking through tunnels. Yeah. But it's once again just an iconic film. Yeah,
great film for sure, and definitely its own thing, right? That's another another series where like almost each of the movies in the series kind of does its own thing. And so, if you've seen other movies in the series, like if you haven't seen Alien, you definitely need to, because it presents its own unique thing that they're not going to really get from any of the other films in the series.
One of the most iconic monsters ever.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
We've already talked a lot about it, so I'll give the floor back to you.
Excellent. So I'm going to talk about another sort of, I would say maybe somewhat obscure film, although I think a lot of people have at least heard of this one, called That Thing You Do, which I think the reason this one made my list is having been a musician for a very long time and having played in bands and stuff like that over the years. I think anybody who has ever had that experience or even flirted with that experience would find this movie highly entertaining and enjoyable, because it basically tells the story of a one-hit wonder, like this band that is from good old Erie, Pennsylvania, who find themselves thrust into the limelight because they write a hit song back in the 60s. And just the journey that they kind of go on, I think, is so relatable to anybody who's ever either been or aspired to be a musician or a songwriter, or dabble in that world at all. I think it's just such a almost perfectly done film in that regard, and just generally like very entertaining and well acted and fun as well, and also a lot of really good music in it to boot.
Catchy tune.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's got Tom Hanks, so.
Yeah, and again, like another example of somebody who, was already established and had a career going, and you kind of use this as a vehicle to like step into a new phase of their career. Because as I recall, he either directed or produced or had some hand in that movie getting made. So I think that was largely thanks to him that project even got off the ground. So. Cool flick though, definitely would recommend it. So what have you got for us next?
Well, I've decided I'm going to cheat because you cheated with the Traveling Wilburys.
That's
so I'm going to do a slight little cheat here.
Okay.
My pick is Reservoir Dogs, a
Mhm.
fine Tarantino movie. But I'd like to add in that Pulp Fiction, equally good. I had a hard time between the two because I love Pulp Fiction, loved Reservoir. Those would be my picks. You got to see them together because they're just such a good double feature. But Reservoir Dogs got the pick because it almost it plays out like a play. You could literally do that movie on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the characters interacting, the snappy dialogue, which Tarantino became known for. It's just another iconic film. Some people might be turned off by some of the violence,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's something that's almost, it's like it's mesmerizing to watch.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember I have this really vivid memory of walking down the street in my college days, talking to a buddy of mine about that film because he had seen it and I hadn't seen it yet.
Right.
And he was describing it to me. And I just remember thinking, just based on his description, that's a movie I need to see. Yeah. And so like that did not disappoint, right? Like when I finally did get the chance to see it, I was like, yep, you were correct, sir. That is a great movie.
Yeah. And I guess the beauty of it, which I guess from like a writer standpoint, is that there was no spaceships, no, man-eating shark.
It's
There's
raw
no
storytelling. Yeah.
Yeah. And he pulled it off. It was just like, this was just,
Mm-hmm.
writing at its most awesomest.
Nice. I'm going to quote you on that.
Yeah.
And he should use that for the next edition, like the next anniversary edition of the Blu-ray. I think that quote is on the box for sure.
Awesomeness.
Yeah. Good times.
So Reservoir Dogs, my pick.
So speaking of writing at its most awesomest, I'm going to talk about one of my films that could easily have made it onto our Guilty Pleasures episode a couple episodes ago, which is Too Fast, Too Furious. Because, spoiler alert, I am actually a huge Fast and the Furious fan. I've seen most of the movies. I haven't seen the newest one yet, but I've seen the first 8, some of which several times. And that second one in particular definitely has a really firm place in my heart, just because of mostly like the relationship between Paul Walker and Tyrese's characters in that movie. I think they're sort of buddy bromance that they have going on, and there's just too funny and too fun and too entertaining to not just put a smile on my face every time I see it. But yeah, those movies, I know they're like super popular, and I know like there's probably some people who just pan them without ever even giving them any consideration because they just are so goofy on so many levels. But I love them, and I really particularly love that one. I think it's just one of the most fun, like, stupid movies that there is.
Yeah. Well, I really liked the first one. I've seen several of them, but I haven't seen the whole franchise. But it was a cool idea, and the driving. I mean, especially if you're into like cars and racing. I mean, it's pretty incredible, the stunts.
Yeah, there's some great stunt work, some just fun situations and scenarios, and obviously, like, there's a lot of just mad suspension of disbelief required in like most of what goes on in those movies, but that's kind of just part of it, right? It's kind of part of what you're buying into. I almost kind of liken it, we haven't really talked about anime at all on the show ever, but I almost kind of think of those movies as like live action anime in a way, where it's just so over the top and so ridiculous, but like you just kind of accept that that's the reality that you're experiencing and kind of go along for the ride. So that's how I'm going to.
And it's got Vin Diesel.
And and again, Paul Walker was awesome in those movies. R.I.P. Paul Walker. I'm sad about that.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's wrap things up for films and move on to our next category, which is video games. So, what have you got for us?
Fun pastime.
Yes, well, in the world of video games.
I'm sure anyone who's watched our episodes or know me would also know that I love World of Tanks. Mm-hmm. As I got older and my reaction time and my eyesight weren't as good, I needed something more slower paced, but strategic. And World of Tanks has it all. You play as a tank commander. You're out there on the battlefields with 15 or so on your side, so 30 in total. People all fighting it out. And the graphics are unbelievable now. And it's online play. So you're playing against real live people.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, good times. Again, as you mentioned, definitely some World of Tanks discussion on episode 1. So go back to the vault for that one if you want to hear more about that. I'm going to move things along, though, and kind of get us going with my first pick, which is the Battlefield series, and specifically Battlefield Bad Company 2, which is probably my favorite first-person shooter experience that I had played in my long history with the hobby. Great destructible environments, great mechanics, great weapons and balance between the factions and the classes available to play. If you're a fan of military first-person shooters, definitely one you should absolutely check out if you have not.
I love playing Battlefield back in the day. but unfortunately, as I get older, as soon as I got onto the playing field, I was all usually shot, and I can't even see who's shooting me anymore.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, there's so many things to do on Battlefield too: planes, helicopters, tanks, infantry.
Yeah, sadly, the series has not ever, in my mind, recaptured the heights that it hit in Bad Company 2. But I'm still kind of hold out hope and pine for a return to form for Battlefield, hopefully someday. But moving along, you had a interesting, somewhat more obscure combat-related game to talk about. So tell us about that.
It's R.U.S.E. It was actually my favorite game. Once again, it was an online game, and then they pulled on the online world out from under us. You played as a specific country, and you had to manage your funds and build your army. But the interesting thing is you only got so much money depending on if you had like a factories built or whatever. And as the money came in, you had to decide what was more important. Did you want to set up infantry, or do you want to anti-tanks? And a lot of it depended on the map as well. And so you had to make the hard decisions. Like you could go for the nuclear option, but it cost a lot. So you're very vulnerable at the beginning if you're putting all your money hoping that the other army's too chicken to come attack right away. And you have enough time, because once you have enough time, you get the bomb wall, of course, and you just blow them up and that's it.
Yeah.
But tanks come screaming in, and you don't have any infantry or any tanks, well, then that factory that's trying to build is gone. So there's a lot of strategy, a lot of stuff. I really miss the fact that they pulled the plug on it, and they didn't do any kind of update or backward compatibility to it too, which is sad.
Yeah, it wasn't one of the things with that game that you could make like fake units, or like you give the impression that you had units that you didn't actually have, because that was the ruse, right? Like that was the whole hook of it, right? You could pretend that you were actually bigger and badder than you actually were, and if somebody never called you on it, they wouldn't know. Which was a very cool mechanic that game had.
It was a fun game. Hours I spent on that game.
Nice.
So what do you have for us?
Speaking of games that I've spent hours and hours on, got to talk about the Gran Turismo series, because being a big racing game fan, I'd say that's probably for me, at the end of the day, as much as I like a lot of other racing games, that's probably my go-to sort of staple that I always return to. And especially Gran Turismo 6, which was the game that I had when I first got my first like racing wheel set up with like the racing seat and the wheel and the pedals and all that sort of thing. And I went like all in on it. That was the game that I really captivated me with that, and got a lot of mileage out of it, you might say.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember when it came out, and just the graphics were so unbelievable compared to like anything. Like they just were all in on that, and I was like, wow.
Oh, and the way the driving felt in those games too, just the steering and the grip and the handling and everything, it just was so head and shoulders above almost anything else at the time. Like unless you were going into like the hardcore simulation realm on like PCs or whatever, like there was really no console game or no like consumer level like video game experience that was anywhere near that at the time, especially. But Gran Turismo's, that's a fun one.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah. So speaking of fun things that have a long history, what do you got?
Metal Gear. Like pretty well all of it.
Yeah.
So it was just, I mean, I'm sure most people know what it is, so I won't get too much into it, but that would be one of my picks. The whole stealth, being this stealthy soldier that you can kill many different ways, and their online play was was fun as well.
Mhm.
And then and it was just the way it grew. It wasn't a game that stagnated. That just didn't. Well, it's the same game but with better graphics. This
Right.
one, stories changed, everything's changed. A lot of work went into these ones, and
Yeah.
the storylines were really cool, and all the different proliferations of snake solid, snake liquid.
Yeah.
It's it was just a fun.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I would say to kind of add to that is just to kind of confirm, like, while Metal Gear Solid 5 is probably arguably my all-time favorite game, I do highly respect and really am impressed by how Kojima managed to actually take all that convoluted nonsense from all those original games and complete that story essentially in Metal Gear Solid 4 in an actual like sane, sensible, like followable way. Like, because I remember thinking when I first started playing Guns of the Patriots, I'm like, there's no way that this like train wreck of a story is actually going to come together in any like satisfying, like tangible way, because it was just so all over the place throughout the whole
Yeah,
series. But man, did he pull that off. Like that fourth game and the way it kind of calls back to everything that came before it and ties everything together and brings it all to like a head and like a nice satisfying, like really resonant conclusion is like I think one of the master strokes of like game development and sort of narrative storytelling in games.
yeah.
It's like that's one that definitely stuck with me like a long time even after playing it.
There were so many nuances in there too. Just these random things like the songs that
Mm-hmm.
play. They have, and then you got a backup like Hawk from Spencer. All of a sudden you had
Yeah.
this woman sniper. You had the dog that you could use
Mm-hmm.
and do commands and send them out to do stuff. And it's just drags you right into the world.
Yeah, those last two, especially, I think 4 and 5 especially, are just
Yeah.
almost like masterpieces, like of the craft of game design, I would say. Um, but before we go too much further down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about a game series. Again, it's a little bit more obscure because I like to dust off some of the more obscure things to talk about, and that is the Grandia series of Japanese RPGs. And specifically, there's one game in the series that I'm particularly fond of, which is Grandia 2, um, which has, I think, one of the better video game stories that I think I've ever experienced. It's got a lot of really interesting theological components to it and philosophical components to it that kind of sneak up on you. It's one of those games where when it kind of starts out, you think, oh, it's sort of just this tropey, adventure, high adventure sort of swashbuckling thing, and then very quickly, all these other additional elements creep into this narrative, and by the end, it's almost like this mind-blowing experience where that game ends up is so far different from where it begins that I wouldn't even want to spoil any aspect of it by like talking about it. Just
Yeah.
if you get the chance, if you like JRPGs at all, if you like really good dense narrative stuff in your game experiences, Grandia 2, you should play that game.
Check it out.
Yeah. So what have you got next?
My next one would be Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. I liked all the
Nice.
Grand Theft Autos, but San Andreas always has a special part in my heart. It's just, I think, the best game that they did. It was just, I think everything about sort of the where it took place, once again, being Canadian, to have like the palm trees and the way the streets are laid out. These like bungalow places, and you could just walk around, cut through whatever in your neighborhood, and the whole idea of just, I don't know, just to build your character up. It was just,
Mm-hmm.
so engaging. I mean, you can do dating, you can work out, you can go eat. It's like The Sims, but more violent.
With explosions and
Yeah,
armor piercing rounds. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It was just yeah. I liked the whole. I liked the setting. I think that was one of the things too I liked about it. I liked the whole that sort of it almost like felt
The
like Compton.
ambiance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was just different. And but yeah, I loved San Andreas. You're a
Nice.
fan of the Grand Theft Auto world?
Yeah. I would say that I am. It's definitely. I think we talked about this on the previous episode where we talked more extensively about GTA. Like Vice City was kind of my jam
Yeah.
as far as that series goes. But I definitely respect and appreciate a lot of what was done with that for sure. And again, if you want to hear a more extensive conversation about GTA, check our archives for that.
What do
But
you have next?
yeah, let me see what we got going on next here. Oh, yes. So again, another bit of an obscure title here with Jagged Alliance, which is a pretty storied series of tactical strategy games that kind of scratches a particular itch I have, which is the idea of running a squad of mercenaries. Because one of my favorite things about Metal Gear Solid 5 is that whole motif, right? That you're building up your mercenary team
Yeah.
as a result of going around and extracting all the people with the Fulton devices and whatnot.
Yeah.
But in these Jagged Alliance games, you basically are a mercenary squad leader who's going down to various places and locales and basically working as a gun for hire. And the scenarios, the mechanics of how the games worked, the cool personalities that all the characters had. There's a lot of great things about those games. If you're at all into tactics and strategy and turn-based gameplay, that's a series that's absolutely like 1,000% worth getting into. And actually, I'm very excited that there's actually Jagged Alliance 3, which has been like long rumored and promised, is nearing completion. So I'm very much looking forward to playing that game at a certain point.
Is it a PC game or is it on consoles as well?
It originated on the PC. The
Okay.
original games were actually DOS games. So if you
Really?
remember the DOS operating system from back in the day.
Yeah.
But there have been other games, tangential games, and other games in the series since then. But I'd say there's probably at this point about 8 or 10 games that have like the Jagged Alliance name to them, and I think at least a couple of them have appeared on consoles. I think Jagged Alliance Rage, which I played and was quite good despite being different from the main series games in a lot of ways. I think that game appeared on consoles, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not
Um,
familiar with it. I'll have to check it out.
yeah, highly recommended for me for sure, that series. But something I know is going to be highly recommended from you is your next pick.
My final pick, Resident Evil, an
Nice.
iconic series of games. Graphic wise, gameplay, I'd have to go with Resident Evil 4, but the earlier
Recently
ones,
remastered.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, is the whole, Raccoon City is always going to have a special place in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going through the house, that mansion, uh just
Yeah, that
the
first
first
game,
time.
man,
Yeah,
that was left an indelible impression, I think, on a lot of people.
yeah, it's just the first time you see the dogs, birds crash through the windows. There's a lot of jump scares. It was and then the
Mm-hmm.
boss, you know
Yeah,
were just always. But yeah, I mean, obviously it was good because they made movies out of it, and lots of
yeah,
movies.
lots of really good movies. coincidentally by the director of Event Horizon, Paul W.S. Anderson.
There you go.
Yeah.
So Resident Evil. I mean, obviously, if you don't know anything about Resident Evil, how'd you even find our podcast?
Yeah. I mean, accidents happen.
I guess.
But once again, if you want a more extensive Resident Evil conversation, that has also occurred on a former episode. So we got you covered if you want to do a deeper dive on a lot of these things.
Yeah.
For sure.
And what is your final pick for video games?
So to wrap up the video games, I'm going to talk about arguably one of my favorite party games, which is a series called Worms. Which, if you're familiar with things like Scorched Earth or Artillery or any of these ideas of like basically a game where you have a bunch of different turrets on the screen and you use them to lob shells and artillery and weapons and stuff at the other players. Imagine that, but with cute, fun little pink worms that talk in strange little British accents as they pummel each other with rocket launchers and bazookas and stuff. Now imagine that you're playing this game in a room full of people who are, let's say, slightly inebriated, and you can imagine how that could turn into a real good time real fast, because you only have so much time to do your move. So if people are perhaps a little bit sketchy in their motor skills and they're trying to like blow the other person up and end up, destroying themselves in the process, comic gold can ensue very easily. But
another one
highly recommended again, especially if you've got friends to play it with, or if you're just a fan of artillery games with a little bit of style to them. Worms, check it out.
There you go. And that concludes video games. So this episode, we've given you our writers, musical art, movies, video games. What could we possibly offer now? Can there be more?
No additional charge.
No additional charge.
We will now present to you the final segment, which is TV shows. So let's kick this off with a true classic.
The X-Files.
There you
You're not
go.
going to hum the theme? I was waiting for you to hum the theme.
I was going to try to whistle it, but actually we've been talking for so long that I think my throat might just crack, and that would be embarrassing. Yeah.
Mulder and Scully, two iconic characters, iconic storyline. His Mulder's sister disappears when he was just a child. He's been obsessed with where she went, what happened to her. He believes in aliens.
The truth is out there.
And not only do you, if you follow the series, are there aliens, there's a whole bunch of other weird, creepy things, even scarier than the aliens.
For sure.
Until you get later on in the episode, then the aliens become really bad.
Yeah.
But it was rewatchable. Most of the shows are like standalones, although they move the general story arc. It's, each one is like a little mystery or story on its own.
Yeah, but you usually had like 3 or 4 episodes per season that are kind of like advancing the main story, which is cool because they would usually like spread those out a little bit. So we're never quite sure when you were going to get some big dose of the overarching tale, which was always fun. Yeah.
But the X-Files, definitely something that you should be watching.
If you've not experienced that, that's one to put high on your to-do list for sure. But speaking of long-running series that I think are fairly beloved by a lot of people who've seen them, I will kick things off with one of my favorite more modern shows, which is Burn Notice, which, for those unfamiliar with the concept of this show, it's basically about a spy who gets stranded in Miami after he gets blacklisted by the government, sort of for something that he did not actually do. and the things proceed and escalate very quickly as it turns out that he becomes the target of the people who blacklisted him and are trying to get rid of him so that he doesn't get the opportunity to prove his innocence. And there's some really cool stuff in that show, not the least of which being Bruce Campbell, who plays a very prominent sort of supporting role in that show and is just as much Bruce Campbell as you would want him to be.
I put it, after you mentioned it, I put it on my to be watched list.
Nice.
So,
hopefully you will enjoy that, because it is quite fun. But I'll let you reserve judgment on that until you get a chance to see it, and you can let us know what your next pick is.
Well, my next pick, completely different than any of my other picks, Seinfeld.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed this one. There's, Jerry, Elaine, Kramer, George, more iconic characters, like Reservoir Dogs, like a play. That's what it was. It just like a play, play about nothing.
I was gonna say it if you didn't. I'm glad you did.
Yeah, but it wasn't everybody's cup of tea. I mean, it was huge, but you either liked the humor, got the humor, or you didn't.
That's the thing, right? Like if you got it, you were all in. I feel like I don't know too many people who were kind of like on the fence about it. They were either all on board or not so much. And I was definitely on board as well. I find that highly entertaining.
I mean, it's just taking day-to-day occurrences and just twisting them around the way he did was genius.
Yeah, for sure.
It was really good. I mean, that whole garage scene, we got lost in the parking garage.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many iconic things.
Yeah.
But yeah, Seinfeld, if you're looking for a dose of humor, which we generally don't talk a lot about on our podcast, but Seinfeld is one to check out.
Well, I think another thing that's interesting about that show is how it diverged from the sort of archetypical template of comedies, right? And that actually kind of leads us into one of my picks, which is a more traditional kind of old school comedy, which is very like influential in my youth, which was MASH, because that was another example of a show that kind of blended drama and comedy in some really interesting ways, and had some like really heavy kind of very poignant moments to it, but was also just really funny in spots as well. And actually I always found it really amusing, going back and trying to watch the original film and how different tonally and structurally that was from what the show ended up being, because it was always funny to me like how much I enjoyed the show and really never clicked with the movie the way that I thought I would, having seen the show and been a fan of it.
Yeah. Once again, it had a great cast, great ensemble cast. That's what really made the story. And everyone was so different. Everyone had their their own quirks, their own personalities. Yeah,
for sure. And actually managed to rotate some cast members out, right? Like as people would leave and new people would come in, but they still managed to maintain that like cohesion and that kind of magic that they had and that chemistry that they had, which was impressive.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw a couple articles way back in the day about people, who had left, thought, they had gotten the fame and the show became big, and then they left, and it was like biggest mistake leaving the show. Because it went on for so many more years where they probably thought it wasn't going to. Yeah, and their shows fizzled out, and they just gave up a plum position. But you snooze, you lose. That's it.
These things happen. We'll talk about that in a little bit again when we get to another one of my picks. But before that happens, we're going to the place you fear the most again, which is space.
Yeah, what do you got? It freaks me out, but I like watching it from the comfort of my.
Be freaked out. Yeah.
From the comfort of my couch. Space isn't that bad.
Nice.
I'm watching other people deal with it. So my next pick is Battlestar Galactica. Now, I like both series, the original series as well as the newer series. Now, the newer series I have to give a nod to because it's just an excellent rethinking of the Battlestar Galactica.
Absolutely.
The storyline, the acting, the whole thing was so plausible too, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's and not only just with the plausible sort of cat and mouse trying to survive the remnants of humanity, but the way they tie in that there's a tie-in with this mystery planet.
Can't really talk too much about that.
I know. I was just about to say something and then I didn't.
You can't do
and
that.
That's such a cool idea as well. But yeah, Battlestar Galactica is another great show that I think a lot more people should watch.
Yeah, I mean, that show is definitely popular, especially among genre fans, but I feel like a lot of people who maybe aren't into sci-fi maybe slept on that show thinking, oh, I'm not that into sci-fi. Trust me, you do not need to be into sci-fi to appreciate that show and how good it is. Like that is a show I think anybody could watch and thoroughly enjoy because there's so much going on there beyond just the sci-fi premise, right? That's what makes that show so great, is that it works on so many different levels, for sure. But speaking of sci-fi shows, I slipped something in here because I heard how much you were a fan of it. So you're going to get to double dip a little bit because we're going to talk about one of my favorite shows from the 90s, which is Sliders, which is all about a boy genius who invents an interdimensional transport system that allows him to visit alternate realities and other versions of Earth. And through a quirky series of events, ends up transporting himself, his college professor, his girlfriend, and a random passerby into one of those alternate dimensions and loses the ability to return to his point of origin. And so the whole show is about them exploring all of these alternate realities and trying to find their way back to their actual reality, and the sort of narrative possibilities that opens up and the things that they get to explore, particularly in the first few seasons of that show, I think are really stunning and often overlooked and underappreciated by people who maybe didn't give that show a fair shake.
It was a great concept, and the worlds that they built were really cool as well.
And some of the coolest ones, right, were the ones where things were just a little bit off, right, where it's like it's basically the world as we know it, but there's this really important little wrinkle or little deviation that like really makes you stop and think, oh man, what if that had gone a different way in the past, and then now we're here as a result of that. Just a really great, cool, fun show that I think sadly not nearly enough people watched when it was on, and also sadly I think kind of suffered in quality as it went on, because there's definitely like a point with that show where they kind of lost the thread, and it didn't kind of maintain its quality. But the first two seasons for sure, and I think at least a good chunk of season 3 are all pretty banging and pretty enjoyable and pretty worth checking out.
I got the DVD set. That's how much I liked it.
As do I. That's definitely one I had to add to my collection as well.
Because it's another one where each episode had its own storyline, even though there was a big overall arc.
Yeah.
So you can just like whip in one episode if you wanted to, and it kind of pretty well came to a close at the end.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things that had a long story arc, why don't you let people know about your next pick?
My next one would be Sopranos.
Forget about it.
It was another one. Well, I mean, I guess not a surprise because Godfather was one of my movie picks. I'm captivated by that sort of world.
Hmm.
And once again, they do the same thing with like the Godfather is they have all the characters, they have the main character and all the satellite characters. They're always constantly revolving, around them. And there's just constant chaos going on, as I guess you'd expect if you were running a underworld criminal,
As
organization.
advertised. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, the acting was really good. The storylines, it was just it was almost like it's like watching a train wreck. It's just like you're
Yeah.
just it's like you're just like it's horrifying, but it's so captivating. You're just kind of watching and like what's going to happen to these characters because the threat's always there. So you're always wondering, well, next episode what's going to happen? Is he going to get out of this one?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
if you like gangster, you know, mafiosa, sort of
Hmm.
organized crime stuff, they did a really good job of bringing it to life. Because I'll be honest, when I first started watching it, I was thinking, I don't know if I'm going to really be into this, and I don't know if they're going to pull off. I thought it was just trying to rip off, sort of The Godfather, but they really built a franchise that was just was par excellence.
Yeah. Yeah. And for sure, definitely extensive Sopranos conversation all the way back in episode 2. If you want to check that out and delve deeper into that rabbit hole with us. But let's talk about my next pick, which is a similarly beloved series from a bit older along the timeline, uh, NYPD Blue, which is probably my favorite police procedural show. And there have been many of those that I've enjoyed over the years, but that one I feel like has a special place in my heart. And I've definitely seen just about every episode of that at least once or twice over the years because it just has such a great like feel and tone and kind of riveting authenticity to it in a lot of ways that I feel like really resonated, especially at the time, when it was airing.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of really great characters and such.
It doesn't really ring a bell. Who's in it?
So that was David Caruso and Dennis Franz originally. And that was
Yeah,
one of those situations where Caruso left the show after the first season and
I
got
remember that
replaced
part.
by Jimmy Smits.
Yeah,
So that was kind of like calling back to the whole people leaving a show thinking that they were
yeah,
the business and then being proven not to be so much.
yeah,
Although Caruso did get to bounce back from that, but yeah, it was kind of a funny. Well, you had mentioned that earlier. I thought that was
yeah,
kind of a funny thing to bring up because that definitely made me think of that situation as well.
yeah.
But
I
yeah,
never watched it.
if you haven't seen NYPD Blue, it's definitely worth a watch. Definitely a classic for sure. Um, but what do you got for us next on the TV front?
Well, my final one ends with a bang. Multiple bangs, actually. Band of Brothers,
Nice.
uh, brought to you by your friends at HBO. This was the idea that it was actually real, just
Mm-hmm.
showing what people went through, in war is something else. I mean, it was just, and not just like the horror of shooting and stuff, but there were certain episodes where they were just showing like the cold when they were stuck in like the Ardennes forest and stuff. It was just like what a nightmare it must have been.
Mm-hmm.
Not just like the artillery and being fired upon, but just
Mm-hmm.
the nature and how I'm sure nature killed probably as many people, disease and the cold.
Mm-hmm.
But this shows a group that start training together until they actually arrive on the European uh, theater of war. So
Mm-hmm.
you see them in training as they all train. People fall, come and go, and then whatever changes, they have the final group. They're parachuted in, and then you watch their exploits as they march through Europe. Amazing scenes. I don't think they skimped at all on costs on this one. It was the realism was sometimes almost too realistic.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, especially with a lot of war-related things, right? Like that. As much as I appreciate and love a lot of those things, you definitely have to be in the right mindset for them, because a lot of that stuff is so heavy and almost like traumatic experience.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing too.
Yeah.
Because with Band of Brothers, you're following a group not just for one movie, but episode after episode after episode. And as in war, things happen to certain characters that you've come to love, and enjoy, and then and because in a war, no one's safe,
right? And it can happen
really
like
reflected
that.
Exactly, and you're just like, oh, I really liked him. I just it's another show I've watched several times, which I also have on DVD.
Yeah, nice. Definitely a classic at this point, I would say.
So Band of Brothers.
Well, speaking of classics, I think there's only one real way to bring this whole thing home. And I positioned this on the list very specifically because I kind of feel like, us both being speculative fiction authors, I think we can both agree that there's probably one TV show that's probably the most iconic, the most influential, probably the most important speculative fiction TV show that's probably ever been, which is The Twilight Zone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Best shows ever.
Yeah. I can't even count the number of things from that show that have influenced me, not only as a viewer, right, but also as an author, for sure.
Yeah. Well, many of my stories are basically could have been pulled right out of a Twilight Zone episode. I mean, obviously it had a major impact on my young mind.
Treading very similar ground in a lot of cases. Yeah. It
was, just to, come in and, watch an episode. Because at one point it was on Fridays. And you'd be out with our friends, but I knew at a certain time I was going home, no matter what we were doing, to go watch Twilight Zone. Same thing with the Night Gallery. Did you ever watch the Night Gallery?
Night Gallery was good too. Yeah. I mean, Rod Serling, just in general, right, was such an original gangster when it comes to that sort of thing, right? Like you really can't touch that guy when it comes to all that. Yeah.
So it's it's the Twilight Zone, definitely one of the most iconic of any genre. Shows we've listed would be number one, probably.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we didn't number these things, but I couldn't help but put this at the end of things, because I just feel like I said, for me, like Twilight Zone is it's right up there. And of course, there are lots of other things too, like Outer Limits and Tales from the Dark Side and all sorts of other things that are in a similar vein. But I think Twilight Zone just deserves kind of its own little pedestal to stand on when it comes to speculative fiction on television, for sure. But
there you go.
Yeah, so that is going to bring us to the end of this marathon session of madness. Whose bright idea was this exactly?
I don't know.
Yeah, I thought you might say that.
Well, it was episode 10.
Here.
Episode 10. Top 10 lists. Just seemed to make sense at the time.
Good times.
I mean, sure, my idea of doing a 10-hour marathon episode, you kibosh that because episode 10, our lists of 10, do it for 10 hours, but you didn't want to do that.
I'm glad I put the kibosh on that one, but we managed to get through it though. We did it. So yay for us.
And we've given people lots of great ideas.
Yes,
You've got
indeed.
great writers to check out, great musicians, great movies, great video games, great TV shows. If you haven't watched them already, go do it.
Yeah, we may never see people again. We may have doomed ourselves.
Yeah. Until next month when our next episode is. You'll never know new and exciting things unless you're watching the post-mortem report.
Indeed. Congratulations. You just survived the post-mortem report. For more information about the show, the hosts, or the things they talked about, visit our official website at postmortemreport.com. And always remember, good posts never die. All right.
My ass hurts.
Yeah, everything hurts. My throat hurts. Everything hurts.